Good evening, everybody. I would like to welcome you to this very special evening at the New School. As you know, this university was established 100 years ago in an assertion of the kind of academic freedom that is essential to a democracy. Today, as we celebrate the centennial of our university, we see a backsliding of democracy taking place almost everywhere in the world. And along with this, on the larger scale than ever, we are witnessing a curtailing of academic freedom, often through legislative maneuvers or executive decrees. We see universities, in many countries, the only sites of politically unconstrained higher learning and debate. We see universities being targeted and closed. Research institutes eradicated, scholars fired, academic disciplines removed by governments from the list of legitimate scholarly disciplines, and museums taken over by governments that want to control both the present and the past. Democracy is under threat, and along with it, knowledge is under threat. My name is Elżbieta Matynia, and I'm the director of the Transregional Center for Democratic Studies at the New School for Social Research. And I want us to celebrate that we probably have the youngest incoming, something like 20 years student here with us, and that's little Annetta right there in the corner. It was 5 years ago, in July 2014, during our annual Democracy and Diversity Summer Graduate Institute in Wroclaw, that a concerned group of our NSSR and TCDS Institute alumni, now living and working in Europe, discussed what they saw as early steps to undermine democracy and first signs of an increasing vulnerability of academia. It was then, and with a kind of a longing for the New School spirit, that they formed the NSSR-Europe Collective. Their first initiative was to institute an annual tribute to exceptionally audacious thinkers, teachers, and doers through a Courage in Public Scholarship Award. The 2019 nominee is Jan Tomasz Gross. It is a great honor and pleasure to have with us today our former dean, the dean of the New School for Social Research, Ira Katznelson, who 3 decades ago, with then the president of the New School, Jonathan Fanton, had opened up our school to a world emerging from the Cold War. Ira, who is now Ruggles Professor of Political Science and History at Columbia University, will introduce this year's awardee for a Courage in Public Scholarship Award.
Well, what an honor, Jan, to be here to honor you and to celebrate a remarkable body of work, and truly remarkable to be here with dear colleagues, Jeff Goldfarb, Jonathan Fanton, Judith Friedlander, Arian Mack, others who were so active and fierce in their democratic commitments and to the principles and character of this institution, really shaping the meaning of this institution. And my remarks are really geared as much to honor, obviously to honor Jan, to honor the New School, and to honor this quite remarkable tradition. So soon after the World Trade Center towers came down, the leaders of the Jewish Theological Seminary sought to comfort and console. They issued a statement before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans in 1770 AD, they wrote, the high priest would pray on behalf of those at risk from catastrophe of nature and war. Emerging from the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, the priests asked, and I quote, that their homes not become their graves. Those priests could not possibly have anticipated the scale and scope of homes becoming graves in whirls of intolerant passion, both before, but especially from the aftermath of the Reformation, from then to our time. We know, and we cannot escape that knowledge. A profound irony is at work. The discovery of social, cultural, and religious pluralism by ancient empires and modern global conquests helped generate the sense of common humanity, the idea that despite many differences, others are more like us than not, that we owe each other a threshold of neighborliness. And yet, divisions between us and them, divisions of faith, geography, and hierarchy, became ever more profound, often cruel and dangerous, precisely as ideas about human fellowship advanced. Propinquity and distance, regard and loathing coincided. Put differently, the continuum from a warm embrace of human difference to killing fields based solely on human difference has become ever more elongated, not only since the Reformation, but also under the wings and aegis of Enlightenment reason. Our most cherished values and institutions are rooted in enlightenment, yet so are dark possibilities. And when there is a fusion between spiritual passion and not quite rational, but rationalistic argument, remarkably dangerous hybrids can develop, with the result that some swaths of humankind are designated as more than strangers, but as Hannah Arendt put things, as superfluous. These might be Africans in the Atlantic crossing, or Jews in Jedwabne. Indeed, the Jewish experience, with its own range from deep incorporation upon legal and civic emancipation, to the loss of 1 in 3 of its members by willful murder, is emblematic of the range conferred by modernity. Tonight, we honor a scholar whose stunning work directly addresses this uncomfortable and dangerous reality. He has done so not just in Neighbors, but before and after that extraordinary book burst painfully and powerfully onto the public realm in 2001. Jan Gross's earlier work considered Poland, both under German and Soviet occupation. There are few articles, as an example, to match the incisive power concerning its subject, as Jan Gross's 1979 essay called Terror and Obedience, a Society Under Occupation. And since 2001, Jan has written much rich analytical accounts of anti-Semitism in Poland after Auschwitz, and he has analyzed the overlapping themes of war, Shoah, and the crisis of the communist order. This is a remarkable corpus that has earned the appellation courageous, the designation central to tonight's Courage in Public Scholarship Award. Jan Gross's body of work confronts us with some of our hardest questions. Not only how some neighbors, people just like us, slaughter residents they know by face and by name, and how other neighbors can rather swiftly lose their full human status to become superfluous, and not only how robust pluralism can be erased in just one day as a result of what might be described as a voluntary effort by civil society. What we are taught by Jan moves well beyond the reconstruction and description of a horrific event, an event that transformed more than 1,500 persons, a majority of the approximately 2,500 individuals who lived in Jedwabne, into burnt corpses in July 1941. To be sure, these were not a random, roughly 2/3 of the town's population, or the losers in a lottery of death. For every victim was a Jew. But just as Jan's study of depravity insists that we must probe insecurity and worse on the overlapping, peril-filled Christian-Jewish and Polish-Jewish frontiers, his work forces us to ask more portable analytical questions. How is what Professor Gross calls the institutionalization of resentment spawned and sustained? How do different situations generate distinct sets of probabilities about the status and life prospects of vulnerable persons who possess features of faith or physiognomy or behavior that many dislike and who are not capable of effectively protecting themselves from sustained assault? Which circumstances of social geography, material arrangements, and cultural and political patterns raise prospects for toleration rather than persecution? How are such structural conditions experienced and interpreted? When and why do persons with the capacity to prevent persecution and brutality act to protect the vulnerable? And when and why do they not? Which categories of human difference become such powerful hallmarks of us and them that the them can be treated as if not human? When and how do rational reasons to oppress entwine with the entirely non-rational? And when does responsibility encompass not just actors and bystanders, but larger patterns of culture, ideas, and institutions? None of these is an easy question. Each, alas, remains urgent for us. Whether writing about a particular horrific event at a specific time and location, or illuminating large-scale arrangements and processes, the power of Jan's writing derives in part from the way he traverses each of these domains of structure and experience, disposition and action. He always insists that we try to understand when and why the worst of human tendencies bursts into full expression. Apart from anything else, he obliges us to look directly at radical evil and not pretend that the ordinary always dominates or that the ordinary is always beneficent. He also distinguishes types of depredation. For the burning barn in Jedwabne was a quite different form of murder than that which took the lives of more than 9 in 10 members of Polish Jewry. Both types were mobilized by actors with intent. Both were efficient, but they are not identical. As one brought to bear the full authority and means of a modern sovereign state that had been captured and was led by a murderous movement, the Third Reich, while the other mobilized from below in a permissive environment provided in this case by the German occupation following a Soviet occupation. Separately and together, the two totalitarianisms changed prospects and probabilities. Jan's indispensable work also implicitly presses us to understand when and why things work out in more decent ways, if only on the understanding that such positive outcomes, marked by toleration rather than persecution, almost always are fragile and contingent. To think otherwise is to grasp for an innocence that so frequently has been mocked by reality. Among broadly positive outcomes, we can identify both the history of Jews in the United States and the story of the New School, whose centenary currently, as Elzbieta said, is being celebrated. These two developments are not quite independent of each other. Consider the United States in the early part of the past century. 1905 was a year of commemoration for American Jews. A quarter millennium had passed since the Dutch West Indies Company had offered a grant of settlement in April 1655 to 23 Jews who had arrived the prior year in New Amsterdam from Recife and the nearby island of Tamarca. Before the Dutch had captured this Brazilian territory from Portugal in 1624, Recife had been home for some 5,000 Jews, primarily new Christians who practiced Judaism clandestinely. Having renewed their public Jewish identity during the 3 decades of Dutch rule, these Jews risked persecution with the return of Brazil to Portuguese control and to the control of its Inquisition in 1654. To that date, no non-Christian, no non-native, and no non-slave population was found in North America, with the exception of tiny numbers of crypto-Jews in New Spain. The Jews landing on the Santa Catarina in New Amsterdam, a settlement of some 800 persons, were accidental pioneers. Like the great majority who had fled, they had set their sights on relatively tolerant Amsterdam. Accosted at sea by armed pirates, Spanish pirates, and stripped of their most precious possessions, they persuaded the ship's captain to sail to New Amsterdam, landing not far from where we're celebrating this evening. So began key features of what became the globe's most advanced experiment in religious pluralism and toleration. The start was uneven. In New Amsterdam, the Jews were made subject to a special tax. Initially, they were refused the right to stand watch, nor were they permitted to open retail shops, establish a visible synagogue, or build or hold office. Notwithstanding, there was nothing in New Amsterdam to equal the Inquisition, or indeed any form of violent persecution. 250 years after the New Amsterdam landing, 750,000 Jews lived in peace in New York City, just over half the nation's 1,400,000. In 1909, a meeting held to form an organized Jewish community in New York was attended by representatives of 74 synagogues, 139 mutual benefit societies, charitable, literary, and educational societies, and 9 Zionist societies. Between August 1904 and August 1906, 52 Jews were elected to local, state, and national office, a period in which 90 Jewish periodicals were published across the country, and remarkably, 47 new synagogues were dedicated in those 2 years, not only in large settlements like Brooklyn, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, St. Louis, but Council Bluffs, Iowa, Green Bay, Wisconsin, Hallettsville, Texas, Natchitoches, Louisiana. In short, 250 years after the reluctant admission of Jews to New Amsterdam, there was much to celebrate. Themes of religious toleration and free expression dominated the various celebrations, including one at Carnegie Hall, then 15 years old. And the one at Carnegie Hall included a letter from Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, included the presence of a former president, Grover Cleveland, the presence of the governor, the mayor, and so on, all celebrating toleration. As a rabbi who spoke, Reform Rabbi of Temple Emmanuel spoke, this was Joseph Silverman, we of this blessed land have particular causes for thankfulness the free institutions of our country, the generous mindedness of our citizens, these are the free springs of American greatness. Now, the dissimilarity then with the condition of Jews in the eastern parts of Europe was stark. When the American Jewish Yearbook sought to count and understand that region's pogroms just from 1903 to 1906, it identified in what it knew to be an incomplete list fully 284 significant incidents, not just the most famous massacres in Kishinev and Bialystok. And it invited additions and corrections, and I quote, to open the way for an accurate record, useful to the statesman and moralist of the present and to the historian and moralist of the future. Even with its supplementary list of pogrom towns and villages whose names have reached us mutilated beyond recognition, like the victims within their own confines, the table, that is the table of data, is not much more than a hint of dark things which have escaped observation and record by a nation in pain or the witnesses of pain. Many Jews killed and wounded is neither statistics nor history. Nevertheless, they wrote, it tells a gruesome story. Towns to the number of 284 are recorded here as the scene of assaults of the particular kind known as pogromy. They had no way to know what was coming, what the coming decades would bring. We have no choice but to reckon with what for us is a chastening and deeply painful past. In liberal America, during the founding periods of the New School, the country's Jews had accomplished what might be called optimal marginality. In 1936, when Fortune devoted a special issue to the Jews in America, the magazine did discern cultural anti-Semitism, and it identified recent efforts to blame Jews for the Depression and other ills by a resurgent Ku Klux Klan, and by such eminent figures as Henry Ford. But the lead article included the following paragraph. By anti-Semitism is here intended not the latent prejudice against Jews, which is a common phenomenon in history. Prejudice against Jews is at least as old as 1654 in North America, and its negative evidences may be found in the histories of most of the clubs and colleges and residential districts of our country. By anti-Semitism here is meant the deliberately incited affirmative racial phobia which has produced the social and economic and sometimes physical pogroms of modern Germany, just as it produced the murderous pogroms of Tsarist Russia. Of that disease, they wrote, there is no American clinical record. Of course, there is much here to be assessed, and of course, America's clinical record of deep racism did not wholly bypass the country's Jews. But what can be said is that the institution where this evening's event is located strongly intersected the American Jewish experience that almost completely lacked political anti-Semitism, as distinct from social, cultural, and institutional anti-Semitism. To be sure, the New School for Social Research that was founded in 1919 was led and taught overwhelmingly by non-Jews, including Charles Beard, Thorsten Veblen, James Harvey Robinson, Emily James Putnam, Alvin Johnson, John Dewey, with Horace Kalin as the leading exception. Still, the New School was embedded in and recruited students from the immense local Jewish community. And it was this New School, in its second founding in 1933, that effectively created a principally Jewish faculty of émigré scholars, fleeing targeted bullying and exclusion. At a time when the core of America's academy, especially its elite institutions, practiced active discrimination in admissions and faculty recruitment, the New School blazed a pathway to egalitarian acceptance. Later, at a moment in which I was privileged to participate during the 1980s and 1990s, the new school turned to East and Central Europe, hoping to play a small part in overcoming the region's anti-liberal regimes. In all, 3 salutes are in order: for the courage of Jan Gross, for the courage of the new school, and for the courage of the best features of our liberal and democratic patrimony. Thank you very much.
Good evening. It's a deep honor for me to be able to speak to you on this very special occasion. My name is Juliet Golden. I'm a researcher and educator working in Central Europe, designing programs for American study abroad students. Since my participation in the first edition of the Democracy and Diversity Summer Institute in Wrocław, Poland in 2010, I feel fortunate to count myself as a member of this unique community of alumni who represent the values and spirit of the New School for Social Research around the world. When the NSSR-Europe Collective was conceived in 2014 in Wroclaw, a year before the Polish national elections that brought the ruling right-wing party to power, there was a celebratory atmosphere surrounding the newly born initiative of an international group of scholars made up of alumni of the New School and the Democracy and Diversity Summer Institutes. Few of us could imagine the drastic change ahead of us. In my travels with students to urban centers and remote sites across Central Europe, we are witnessing how public scholars and civic activists are being increasingly isolated and threatened. We also see how they draw inspiration from Professor Gross's scholarship and his courage. It is in this increasingly oppressive intellectual environment that the recent squelching of open society and the palpable disintegration of democracy have been taking place in Poland and other countries of Europe. That is why we commend Professor Gross's tenacity in exposing hidden and silenced pasts and his unyielding voice in public debate so critical to our democratic life. The NSSR community is therefore proud to confer upon Professor Jan Tomasz Gross its fourth Courage in Public Scholarship Award.
Thank you very much, really, for recognition that I'm receiving today. It's a very moving occasion for me, for many reasons. But what makes it very unique is really my deep, heartfelt association with this institution. It has been, for me, a place where I spent innumerable hours at seminars and discussions, and just thinking about it and its phenomenal tradition and the various people who have taught here. Hannah Arendt, for example, who is such an important figure in my intellectual development, if you will. I hope you will forgive me, but I will share with you sort of intellectual autobiography. It may be longer than you are ready to really listen to, but here it is. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. From the time I entered Warsaw University as a Yeah, if you tell me how great. Well, yeah. I can hold it too. From the time I entered Warsaw University as a freshman, my academic trajectory was rather unusual. Ever since I remember thinking about it in school, I knew that at the university I would study physics. Mathematics came easily to me, but as I was soon painfully to discover, not beyond the high school level. And I chose physics as a field of study because I thought it was also about the world. Somewhere in my mind, the idea lingered that physics would serve as a good bridge to philosophy. A sympathetic commentator can appreciate in this jumbled reasoning an embedded Kantian understanding of the hierarchy of human sciences. Okay. Yes? All right. But it bespoke, most of all, confusion, showing that I didn't know what to do. The important thing was that it made my parents happy. Under real socialism, a child who chose a career relatively immune from political supervision by the state was a real gift to his or her parents, especially that my family tradition on both sides was to pursue the law, a really politically tainted field in the People's Republic of Poland. Even though I never entertained the thought of law studies, though after 2 years I switched from physics to sociology, I still managed to have an early brush with the law. I got in trouble with the police while still in high school. It was not, however, what you may think. It was Adam Michnik, a very well-known person in this institution, a recipient of an honorary doctorate some 30 years ago. Already as a child, Adam had a bad influence on his friends. For one, being a precocious child and an avid reader since early youth, especially curious about Polish history and communism, Adam stole books from his friends' parents' libraries. And so I, of course, became an accomplice. But it was not theft that the security police hold us to interrogation for. We were the original baby boomers, the post-war generation born between 1945 and 1947. In Eastern Europe, significantly, this made us also the first 20th century cohort that did not directly experience the full force of totalitarianism. Nazi occupation of the region was over before we were born. And given that communist regimes mellowed within 2 or 3 years after Stalin's death in March of 1953, Stalinist brutalities didn't directly affect us either because we were too small. When Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin's crimes and the cult of personality in his famous secret speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1956, we were still in elementary school. My friends, for the most part, came from a leftist secular milieu with a tradition of political engagement. Our parents, before the war, were either communist or socialist party members or sympathizers, and to their quasi-universal chagrin, we, their children, also fell for the ethos of speaking and acting on behalf of worthy causes. Our sense of security, springing from the lucky coincidence of being born after the war, and the belief that ideals and the practice of socialism could be harmonized into a socialism with human face, to use a well-turned phrase popularized later during the Czechoslovak Prague Spring, gave us the impetus to establish, while still in high school, a discussion club. I know this sounds silly, but activity on behalf of freedom of speech, and this is what we were up to, speaking our minds, under authoritarian regimes that deny it to their citizens, consists mostly and primarily of acts of speech. In time, we made ourselves enough of a nuisance for the regime so that it clamped down on our milieu as well. High school and early university years had a formative influence on my life. I met people then who remain my lifelong friends and interlocutors. We were curious about the world, and given the state of media technology at the time, this meant reading and talking a lot. Given the politics of the region in which we lived, this eventually got us into serious trouble. Scores of us would end up imprisoned for longer or shorter periods. Adam Michnik clocked over 6 years in jail before the 1989 revolution put an end to communism in Eastern Europe. Many people, including myself, were pushed into exile. Altogether, these experiences formed a bond that has lasted a lifetime. For me, and the group of friends who started discussing politics and history in the early 1960s, the real moment of truth came in 1968, during the so-called March events. In the aftermath of the June 1967 Six Days War in the Middle East, where client states of the Soviet Union, Egypt and Syria suffered a humiliating defeat in the war they provoked with Israel, the Soviet bloc countries broke diplomatic relations with Israel and deployed anti-Zionist propaganda. In Poland, the secret police funneled inflated stories and accounts to the first secretary of the Communist Party about Jews, including party members who allegedly went about celebrating the Israeli victory. Władysław Gomułka, the first secretary of the Communist Party at the time, well known for his temper tantrums, got incensed and at the first opportunity during the National Congress of Labor Unions, delivered an incendiary speech denouncing a Zionist fifth column, an evocative term of opprobrium meaning traitors, inviting those who, as he put it, felt that Israel rather than Poland was their mother country to emigrate and leave Poland altogether. A few months later, on the wave of cresting official anti-Semitism, a secret police-dominated faction, the communist establishment, decided to make its bid for top party leadership. They failed, but not before unleashing an official anti-Semitic campaign cloaked in anti-Zionist garb, which led to a brutal pacification of the nascent student movement and creative intelligentsia, which had been calling for greater cultural freedom and liberalization. After a brief imprisonment, I was kicked out of the university. To male students, this meant a revocation of draft exemption and the prospect of a 2-year military service, and together with my parents decided to take the option to emigrate made available by the regime in a fit of pique. While waiting for an immigrant visa to the United States, I got lucky and obtained a graduate fellowship to continue studying sociology at Yale University. I've given this trove of personal details here because my engagement with the history of the German occupation of Poland during the Second World War came about, in a manner of speaking, for autobiographical reasons. To move from Warsaw, dreary and steeped in official anti-Semitic propaganda, into the intellectual comfort of Yale University's ivory towers was quite a culture shock. It further accentuated the contrast between our student movement's joyous engagement with liberty and freedom of speech and the dull, repressive quality of real socialism. The secret police may have pulverized the student and intellectual milieus during the March events and their aftermath, sending people to jail and into exile in the process. But what the regime got for their trouble bode ill for its future. A wave of mediocrities moving into faculty positions at universities, cynical careerists pushing for accelerated job advancement in the administration, and hack journalists dressing their anti-Semitism in anti-Zionist rhetoric becoming the darlings of party propaganda. In scholarly literature about real socialism, such phenomena are called a mechanism of negative selection. Barely 5 months later, in August of 1968, a much more robust popular demand for political liberty, the Prague Spring, was cut short in Czechoslovakia, this time by a combined military effort of Warsaw Pact countries. Afterwards, it felt in one's bones that the Soviet bloc regimes were non-reformable and unable to accommodate people's natural desire to live in freedom. So, while we may have lost a battle in March of 1968, I thought that in the proverbial long run, Polish society would cast off its Communist Party laurels. Before too long, in fact. Hence, the autobiographical context for my curiosity about what makes society resist repressive institutions and safeguard its freedom. In some small measure, we had done such a thing as students in Warsaw. And it occurred to me that the history of Polish resistance against the German occupation during the Second World War would provide a very instructive case for how this had been done on a grand scale, so to speak. This is what led me to choose as dissertation topic Polish society under German occupation, the Generalgouvernement, 1939-1944. When I was finishing my degree, there was still considerable overlap between social sciences and history and reasonably generous funding for area studies. Admittedly, this was not the most common practice, but I moved between disciplines without too many eyebrows raised. After teaching in the Department of Sociology at Yale and at Emory University, and then in the Department of Political Science at NYU, I was finally hired by the History Department at Princeton. And yet, intellectually, I didn't move. I have always done research and writing in the same manner. What happened was that the disciplinary boundaries were shifting. I felt that my career paralleled the experiences of those 20th century residents of Transcarpathian Ruthenia, who, while always remaining in one place, over the course of a lifetime nevertheless managed to acquire the citizenship of 4 or 5 different countries. But witticism aside, my apprenticeship in sociology taught me a fundamental premise, that social phenomena, or if you will, facts on the ground, do not occur in isolation. This may not seem like rocket science, but when inculcated early into a student's imagination, it frames the manner in which one inquires about the world. One learns that any assertion of a social fact implicitly commits to a broader narrative, because it automatically limits the range of other simultaneous or future phenomena that could have plausibly taken place. Given common sense and the general knowledge of human nature, if X has occurred, then in all likelihood neither Y nor Z nor W, which are incompatible with X, could have taken place as well. And while we may be interested in X, it happens occasionally that X is inaccessible for direct measurement, but we can gather empirical evidence about some Y, Z, or W, and in such indirect manner verify or invalidate claims concerning the occurrence of X. I will later give an example from my own thinking along these lines about the conundrum of Polish-Jewish relations during the war. For now, let me add also what in hindsight I realize was the significance of my short brush with physics for the way I approach the study of history. I think instinctively about historical material in terms of problems that need to be solved. This is what students of physics have to do for their weekly assignments, solve a bunch of problems for the next class. Such a frame of mind for a historian is very much a mixed blessing. After all, what we strive towards and value most in our discipline is writing a story, culminating in an overview of a historical period. Tony Judd's Post-War comes to mind as a good example. Or writing a synthesis of a historical phenomenon, such as Scholl Friedlander's diptych Nazi Germany and the Jews, followed by the years of extermination. I wouldn't be able to do anything of the sort. I can only do narrowly focused history, trying to make sense of a particular aspect of the flow of events. A serious limitation of scholarly abilities, but at least I am aware of it. Nothing that I have written in my dissertation about Polish society under the German occupation makes me blush on rereading today. But while nothing I wrote there is embarrassing, I nevertheless blush because of what I have left out. There is nothing, or to be exact, altogether a page and a half in the book about the Jews. And I wasn't even aware of missing anything, because the historiographical standard at the time, whether one wrote about Polish or French or Dutch or any other European society under occupation, was to leave everything concerning the Jews aside. This was a different subject, as it were, a different field of specialization, and a different set of scholars were writing about it. None of my advisors, all distinguished Europeanists, with an eminent historian of modern Poland among them, raised any questions about this omission. When I think back now about the writing of this book, I realize that I didn't have to do much editing of the sources in order to construct the narrative in this manner. There were 2 major archival collections in London, the General Sikorski Institute and the Underground Poland Study Trust. This is where I went to do research, and I spent many months buried in documents produced by the underground Polish state, and only rarely, usually as an appendix, found more than a brief mention of the Jews. The underground state in Poland, Państwo Podziemne, was for all practical purposes an entity defined by ethnicity rather than citizenship. Legally and institutionally, with a government in exile situated in London, it was, as much as it could be, a continuation of the Polish state. but its practice in the home country, its allocation of resources, the numerous organizations that it spawned, as well as its rhetoric, there was a huge variety of underground publications, left out 1/3 of Poland's pre-war citizens, the so-called ethnic minorities. After my dissertation was published, I embarked upon another project stimulated by a find at the Hoover Institution, where I stumbled upon reams of files in unopened carton boxes. I found there thousands of interviews conducted by the Historical Bureau of the Polish Army in the East, known as the Anders Army, from the name of its commanding general, Władysław Anders. This army was recruited from Polish citizens released from custody in Soviet camps or forced settlement. A reminder for those of you who don't have a specialized knowledge about the Second World War, that for the first 2 years of the Second World War, between September 1939 and June 1941, Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany were de facto allies. They together dismembered Poland. The USSR occupied half of Poland's territory and imprisoned or deported into the Soviet interior several 100,000 of Polish citizens. So the Anders Army was recruited from Polish citizens released from custody in Soviet camps or forced settlement after the USSR was finally attacked by Nazi Germany and joined the Allies in their fight against Hitler. As part of the process, the Soviets also renewed diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile, residing in London at the time, set free Polish citizens, including the army veterans they had previously deported or arrested, and allowed, indeed encouraged, the creation of a Polish army in the USSR. In 1942, they allowed the 100,000 people thus assembled, Polish military personnel and their families, to leave the Soviet Union for the neighboring Iran, where Polish units could be easily supplied and outfitted by the British. This was the population from which the Polish authorities harvested information about conditions of life under the Soviet rule by distributing questionnaires on a number of issues. I culled from these testimonies rich material, and even though there were gaps, I was able to write a comprehensive monograph entitled Revolution from Abroad, Soviet Rule in Poland, in Poland's Western Ukraine and Western Belorussia, 1939 and 1941, which came out in 1988. Ostensibly, this was a step sideways from my earlier focus on the German occupation of Poland, taking me even further away from what I left out in the first monograph, namely that which had happened to Jews, and which was starting to preoccupy me more and more. It turned out, however, that I could not have planned more prudently the sequence of investigations into Poland's wartime history. When my book Neighbors came out in the year 2000, the main line of pushback from patriotic historians, journalists, and assorted experts was to argue that I was presenting the story out of context, because the town of Jedwabne was in the Soviet zone of occupation until June 1941, and Jews were guilty of collaboration with the Soviets. If I hadn't written Revolution from Abroad and also published with my wife 2 volumes of documents about the period, I would have been stumped. Instead, unlike my opponents, who were repeating cliches about Jews and communism, which to boot were historically incorrect, I knew the sources and the relevant literature, which I had studied for years while preparing in the 1980s the 3 books I wrote and edited about the Soviet occupation. All along, while researching and writing about Soviets' rule between 1939 and 1941, I was reading about Jewish experiences under German occupation. It was becoming clear to me that the Polish-Jewish relations during the war were much more fraught, much worse than Polish scholarship was willing to admit. The turning point for me was the collection of documents, Ten z ojczyzny mojej, he is from my mother country, put out by Professor Władysław Bartoszewski. He was a man of impeccable intellectual integrity, himself courageously engaged during the war in the activities of the well-known Committee to Help the Jews, Żegota. In 1969, together with his co-author, Zofia Lewinówna, he published a volume of Jewish testimonies collected immediately after the war from survivors. All these testimonies are stored now in the large archival collection number 301 at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, today accessible online, some 7,000 of them. The aim of the publication was to document how Poles extended assistance to Jews during the war. And indeed, all the testimonies that one could read in the volume had a happy ending. They came, after all, from survivors. But what happened to these Jews before they finally stumbled upon someone who helped them to hide till the end of the war was horrifying. A long series of betrayals, often by people they knew from before the war. If this was the best proof that could be mustered in defense of Polish goodwill and assistance, I trembled at the thought what thousands of remaining testimonies in the archives would reveal. And when I could finally travel back to Poland after 1989 and went to the Institute to read its archival collections, my premonitions were confirmed. I found there, among others, the testimony of Szmul Wasserstein about Jedwabne. So, what was the view on Polish-Jewish relations during the war that I found wanting? In Polish historiography and general collective wisdom, it means in layman's views or journalistic accounts, a consensus prevailed that the comportment of the Polish population toward the Jews during the war was explainable by the extraordinary brutality of German repressions. Nowhere else, only in Poland, the argument stipulated, was helping the Jews punishable by death and, what is more, for the entire family of the person daring to violate the prohibition. Hence, this help was the most dangerous form of anti-Nazi activity. No wonder then, the explanation goes, that Poles behaved towards the Jews the way they did. There was a tiny minority who took risks and helped the Jews, irrespective of consequences, and indeed some were killed for their heroism. Those Poles who declined to offer assistance, however, cannot be blamed, because one cannot impose on people as a presumed standard that they behave like heroes. As to a tiny minority that blackmailed Jews who were trying to hide and betrayed them to the Germans, well, there is always scum in society, and besides, they were marked as outcasts by the underground state and the rest of society, which called them with the derogatory term szmalcowniks. And courts of the underground Polish state punished them severely, including with the death penalty. This was a very handy explanation, which rendered all things transparent. It also conveniently implied that the interface of relationships between Poles and Jews during the German occupation was narrow. The vast majority of the population, the normal Poles, so to speak, allegedly lived their own separate existence, and only a numerically small group of outliers, villains and heroes, had anything to do with the Jews. We know today that this is all wrong, that explaining Polish behavior by invoking fear of German repressions does not hold water, and that the factual premises on which this argument is based are false or misleading. First of all, the interface of relationships between Poles and Jews was extensive, involving broad segments of the population. Hundreds of thousands of Jews, in all likelihood over 1 million, had been killed in Poland during the Holocaust in situ, in their places of residence, in full view of the local population. And millions of local residents benefited materially from the destruction of Jews. Secondly, collective responsibility was used by the Germans to enforce obedience with respect to all kinds of regulations. And many more people were killed in reprisal for underground activity, for example, than for helping the Jews. And while assisting and sheltering the Jews was indeed an especially dangerous activity in occupied Poland, it was not because those caught in the act were uniformly killed, because they weren't, but because they were uniformly spied upon by their neighbors and denounced to the so-called dark blue police, an auxiliary formation staffed by Poles in German employ, who would usually beat and rob the helpers and then let them go while killing the apprehended Jews. But this is the knowledge that we have today. We also know that the real issue concerning Jews and Poles during the war was not refusal to help on the part of the Poles, but widespread acquiescence of the Polish population and occasional complicity in persecution of the Jews. What makes the history of the German occupation a difficult history for the Poles today is not that too few non-Jewish Poles were bringing assistance to their Jewish fellow citizens, but that too many were complicit in their spoliation and murder. We know now where to look for empirical evidence that expands our understanding about the sections of Polish society involved in those misdeeds. Monographs about such phenomena are being written as we speak. But 30 years ago, we were still in the dark about these things. When in 1987, an eminent literary critic, Jan Błoński, published in Poland's equivalent of New York Review of Books, in the Catholic weekly Tygodnik Powszechny, an article entitled Poor Poles Look at the Ghetto, taking off a poem by Czesław Miłosz, in which he argued that it should have some significance for the Poles that the soil of their country has been soaked in Jewish blood, and that consequently Poles ought to take some ownership of the Jewish catastrophe, mourn the victims, for example. Even though, and Błoński said so explicitly, God had stayed the Poles' hand and they had not directly partaken in the murder of the Jews, the venerable weekly was inundated by protest letters from its readership, which comprised at the time the most sophisticated and open-minded segments of Polish intelligentsia. The gist of the angry response to Błoński's article was that the Poles owed the Jews nothing for their behavior during the Holocaust, that Polish people did as much as they could to help, and that they should deservedly take pride in it. Błoński's article is now viewed as the beginning of Polish critical re-examination of the society's self-satisfied perception of its own comportment toward the Jews during the war. But in fact, a year earlier, an émigré quarterly journal, Annex, devoted an entire issue to the examination of Polish-Jewish relations during the war, which included articles pushing the matter beyond Błoński's framing of the issue. I had a piece there too, entitled, "He is from my mother country, only I do not like him." It was an ironic transposition of Władysław Bartoszewski's book title, and I made an argument in the article guided by the sociological principle that social phenomena do not occur in isolation. I never liked the standard explanation about what happened between Poles and Jews during the war. The argument along the lines, we were afraid to help the Jews because of the ferocity of German repressions, seemed unpersuasive from the start, given the widespread, and one could even say reckless, engagement of Poles in clandestine activity aimed against the Nazi occupation. The Polish anti-Nazi underground state, in fact, a broadly based social movement comprising an entire spectrum of groups from school-age children to military veterans, was the most robust undertaking of its kind in all of occupied Europe. In this context alone, the argument Poles did not do something or other because they were afraid did not hold water very well. But there was more than did not fit with this purported explanation. For example, how could one incorporate into it yet another well-known phenomenon, a universal hostility towards the Jews in post-war Poland? Should there not have been, if the argument Poles did not help their Jewish fellow citizens more because they were afraid were true, should there not have been instead a period of mourning and soul-searching among the Poles after the war over the monstrous calamity that the Jews had suffered, unaided by their fearful fellow Polish citizens? And shouldn't those who were prevented, allegedly by their own fear, from helping human beings exposed to mortal danger, have been greeting the very few returning now against all the odds to their homes and lavishing them with affection over their miraculous survival while sharing in their grief over the loss of their families and kin? In reality, lone survivors returning to their towns and villages were routinely greeted with an off-putting, "So, you are still alive." and if lucky, were discreetly advised to go away, or else they were told they risked being killed. And many had been killed. While before the war, over 2 million Jews lived in shtetls in Poland. After the war, Jewish survivors could reside in relative safety only in a few of the largest cities. Why were the Poles, who despite all odds had hidden and assisted some Jews during the war, why were they afraid afterwards to disclose their noble deeds, lest their neighbors ostracize them, or worse, for what they had done? Shouldn't they instead, if it was only fear that prevented Poles from helping the Jews during the war, shouldn't they instead have been celebrated in their communities as heroes? Why was it standard practice, after the occupation was already over, for those who hid the Jews to beg their wards as they were coming out of hiding not to reveal to anyone the identity of their helpers? I argued in the essay that rather than fear of German reprisals, a more powerful explanation for reluctance to help the Jews was a widespread and acute anti-Semitism among the Poles. Reading underground press, published clandestinely by all political milieux, brought ample evidence that this sentiment was shared. In Polish society under the German occupation, there was no social norm dictating that Jews in mortal peril ought to be given assistance. And people who, despite all odds, helped the Jews were ostracized in their own milieux. Likewise, anti-Semitism, rather than fear of the Germans, explained Polish attitudes towards Jewish survivors and those who had helped them that were on display after the war. After my essay on Polish-Jewish relations during the war appeared in 1986, I continued reading on the subject and published a short book in Poland 10 years later, in 1998, called A Horrible Decade. But the events in Jedwabne went beyond what I imagined to have been possible. Even though by the time I had a very good knowledge of the wartime period, when I finally came to grips with the story of the Jedwabne murders, I was stunned by the realization that the killing had been indeed carried out pretty much as described by Shmuel Wasserstein, whose immediate post-war testimony about Jedwabne I read in the archives of the Jewish Historical Institute, and found initially unbelievable. And this was not because of my naivete, I hasten to add. Before an acrimonious debate about neighbors began, I heard from a senior Polish historian specializing in World War II, as well as from Israel Gutman, the chief historian at Yad Vashem at the time, that they too were both shocked by the account of the Jedwabne murder, as it did not conform with what each of them independently knew about the epoch. There was a surplus in the Jedwabne story, if you will, of many kinds. To begin with, for an indigenous killing episode perpetrated by the locals, the number of its victims, as well as the number of perpetrators, were stunning. The manner in which the murders were carried out, specifically the deliberate effort to round up all the Jews who had lived in town, including women, children, and the elderly, was something new as well, since in July of 1941, the Einsatzgruppe, Nazi killing squads on the Eastern Front, were still targeting only, or in any case primarily, grown-up Jewish males. The exclusively Polish ethnic composition of the perpetrators was also a revelation. Historians knew about mass killings in which the local population had participated, but not in central Poland, only in multi-ethnic areas further east and north, where Ukrainians and Lithuanians were also involved. In some, there was a radical novelty to this event, even for people who knew or had contributed themselves to Holocaust historiography. Writing neighbors, a simple task from the vantage point of a historian's craft, since it was a well-circumscribed story based on a limited number of sources, had been emotionally and intellectually very difficult. Tony Judd recalls in the volume of Conversations with Tim Snyder how I talked to him at the time of the writing, utterly perplexed by what happened in Jedwabne and the event's implications. I also worried whether I would be able to find a publisher in Poland. This troubled me because I was persuaded that the book must come out in Polish before it saw the light of day in the English language. I didn't know what reaction disclosure of the Jedwabne murders would produce, and certainly did not anticipate the national debate across all media lasting for over 6 months, which neighbors triggered. But I thought that the Polish public, whether limited only to scholars or including others as well, should have a chance to reflect on and discuss the content of the book before anybody else. I recalled the publisher of Horrible Decade telling me how, for the first time in his career, his employees in the printer's shop protested about the content of a manuscript. The book was published regardless, but Horrible Decade, compared with Neighbors, was highbrow and much less direct about the complicity of Poles in the persecution of Jews during the war. In the end, I sent the manuscript to a friend, Krzysztof Czyżewski, also known at this institution, at the Borderland Foundation, who realized its importance and put it out quickly. The book was published in May 2000, just in time for the Warsaw Book Fair. Immediately, still in May, a journalist from the center-right daily Rzeczpospolita went to Jedwabne to check the story and confirmed by talking to the town's inhabitants that indeed the local Poles, and not the Germans, as the inscription on an official monument commemorating the event proclaimed, committed the murder in 1941. Apart from that, except for scathing remarks in a populist Catholic daily that the book was all anti-Polish propaganda, for the first 6 months after the publication of Neighbors, there was practically no reaction. Pogranicze, as the Borderlands publishing house is called in Polish, is a small boutique publisher with limited distribution. Whether this played a role in the delayed reaction, I do not know. Later on, when the national debate was already in full swing, Czyżewski put an electronic version of the book on Pogranicz's website so that anyone with a computer could download Neighbors free of charge. When meeting with student audiences in the spring of 2001 at university campuses, I would often be asked to autograph computer printouts of the book. Writing Neighbors and reflecting in the light of events in Jedwabne on the significance of what had happened to Jews in Poland during the war posed a double quandary. The first outstanding issue on my mind after completing Neighbors was to figure out how historians of the war period could have missed the story of the massacre in Jedwabne for so long. The publication of 2 volumes of essays and documents by the Institute of National Memory in 2002, entitled Wokół Jedwabnego, concerning Jedwabne, which was the result of an official Polish investigation of the Jedwabne murder, rendered this question moot. In the preface to this important publication, the editors, summarizing the findings of the team of scholars who researched the matter, wrote that Jedwabne was but an episode in a 2 or 3 months long killing spree during which Polish neighbors kept murdering local Jews in some 24 villages in the Podlasie region, in which Jedwabne is situated. Mind you, these acts of violence were perpetrated openly. Everyone in the vicinity knew about what happened, and many participated directly. This means that there were tens, indeed hundreds of thousands of people who had personal knowledge of these events. And this knowledge remained active in local communities after the war, passed along from one generation to the next. Journalists who visited the area in the year 2000, before the story became a focus of national debate, discovered that even young people were knowledgeable about the murders and knew that the locals, rather than Germans, were responsible. And yet, none of this had entered into the historiography of the period. It is somewhat disappointing, I must confess, that members of the historical profession in Poland have not reflected since on the reasons why this had been so. The topic, I suppose, is still awaiting an ambitious PhD student. Secondly, I was bewildered. How could I have been ignorant for so long about the widespread complicity of the local population in the persecution of Polish Jews during the war? Not that I doubted my ability to think as a historian and draw proper conclusions from amassed evidence. An aerial generation of historians was responsible for this blind spot in Polish historiography. Something else, of a personal nature, bothered me about my long-lasting ignorance. I had a wonderfully open relationship with my parents. We talked about everything, especially with my mother, who was a brilliant, sophisticated, and very spiritual person. How could she not have communicated to me the depth of demoralization of the Polish population during the occupation as manifested in the widespread murderous hostility towards the Jews? I wondered. After all, this mattered to her intimately. Her first husband was denounced as a Jew and killed in 1943. And later, after she met my father, also an assimilated Polish Jew, she again had to rack her brains how to keep him safe. But there were more reasons than just her personal concerns for the man she loved why she should have been aware of this matter. My mother served as a courier in the Bureau of Information and Propaganda of the Home Army during the war. The Home Army, or AK or AK for short, was the mainstay of the Polish underground state, where her first husband, Stanisław Wertheim, had been an editor of an internal bulletin called Current News, collating social and political information coming from all over occupied Poland to Home Army headquarters. Consequently, she was as well informed as anyone about what was going on in the society under occupation. Why, I wonder, had I not learned from her what later took me dozens of years to figure out on my own? She must have known about what was going on. Or didn't she? Because if she knew, it would have shaken her to the core, and we would have talked about it at home, I thought. Wartime was a frequent subject of conversations, also between my parents and their friends who came to visit. Restaurants were expensive and pretty horrible in Soviet bloc countries, and people preferred to socialize at home. And while these friends came to visit, I hung out in the dining room listening to what they were talking about. And the issue, as best I remember, never came up. It was too late to ask her or my father why it was so, since they were both deceased, by the time I thought of the matter. So, in search of an answer, I decided to find out what the underground authorities did know about the mass killings of Jews by their Polish neighbors at the time when these atrocities took place. It turned out that the question can be easily answered. Again, thanks to the self-same investigation of the Jedwabne murder launched by the Institute of National Memory in 2001. In the second volume of Concerning Jedwabne, a section entitled The Documents of the Polish Underground State on the Situation in the Białystok region following June 22, 1941. June 22 is the day of German invasion, attack against the Soviet Union, contains reports about the killings of Podlasie Jews by their neighbors. It includes a July 4, 1941 dispatch to London from the commander of the Home Army, General Rowecki, sent a whole week before the Jedwabne massacre took place, and I quote, "First reports from the conquered territories reveal instinctive sympathy to liberators from the Bolshevik oppression, in other words, towards the German troops. In Brześć, a border town between what used to be German and the Soviet zone of occupation of Poland, Poles liberated from prison organized the pogrom of Jews," unquote. Rowecki's telegram is followed by other reports informing about multiple locations where, and I quote again, the local Polish population carried out pogroms or even massacres of the Jews, unquote. In other words, the Home Army Command and the leadership of the underground state knew in real time about massacres of Jews by their Polish neighbors. But there is no evidence in the secret correspondence or in the underground press that the matter was followed up in any fashion. How was it possible that such a wave of crimes against Polish citizens committed over an extended period by numerous Poles did not elicit curiosity, not to speak of a robust response from the Polish underground authorities? After all, the underground state considered offsetting the demoralizing effects of Nazi occupation on the Poles as one of its primary responsibilities. And what could be more demoralizing than joining the Nazis in killing sprees of fellow Polish citizens? I devoted an entire chapter in Fear, my next book after Neighbors, to musings about these questions. In essence, I argued, the Polish intelligentsia screened out what was happening on the lower ranks of the Polish society from the narrative of Poland's wartime tragedy. Not so much because of its anti-Semitic prejudices, but because it was blinded by social distance. Acute awareness of class distinctions, a residual mentality from the time when nobility was still the ruling class in society, was deeply entrenched in the thinking habits of Poles throughout the interwar years as well. Even the progressive circles of the intelligentsia were not immune to it. And so, since the drama of wartime experience was immersed in a rich symbolic brew reminiscent of the 19th century story of the loss of Poland's independence and national uprisings, all that pertained to war and resistance, a spiritual realm endowed with symbolic significance, was sacred ground reserved for the elite of the nation. Once upon a time, it was a province of the nobility. Now, the tragic destiny of the country, forged in the crucible of the Second World War, cast the Polish intelligentsia as the main protagonist. Indeed, it was the intelligentsia's last grand turn on the historical stage, where it played a hero, as a repository of patriotic ethos and an architect of wartime resistance, a victim, as Soviet and Nazi occupiers targeted elites for particularly severe persecution, a narrator of current events, through penmanship in the proliferating underground publications, and eventually as interpreter of the experience, its record keeper and its historians. It should not come as a surprise, I concluded, that in such circumstances what went on between Jews and peasants was noted by underground rapporteurs, but only as local episodes without a larger significance. Such occurrences did not merit any other evaluation. By definition, what went on downstairs between the common people and the Jews could not have had a larger significance. It did not deserve to enter the mainstream myth-producing narrative about Poland's wartime struggles and victories. There was, of course, local knowledge of the events, and it never dissipated, as journalists visiting Jedwabne 60 years after the murder of local Jews discovered. But the larger public, including the professionals whose business it was to register what happened, as rapporteurs working for the underground state, could not translate this scattered information about local events into knowledge about the epoch. This is what I told myself, and I haven't heard a better explanation yet of this glaring omission. But it is water under the bridge now, as historians affiliated with the Center for Research about the Holocaust in the Polish Academy of Sciences since 2005 have kept publishing meticulously researched books and articles detailing the complicity of the local population in the murder and pillage of their Jewish neighbors. This is an amazing development, unique to Poland among all the countries situated to the east of Germany, where 90% of all the Jews killed in the Holocaust resided until the war. Today, the history of the Holocaust in Poland is being written by a host of talented and committed Polish historians, anthropologists, social psychologists, literary critics, what have you. 30 years after the country regained its full sovereignty, a major part of its past, disowned for 6 decades, is being reappropriated and returned by scholars to where it belongs, into the mainstream of 20th century Polish history. I wish I could end my confessional lecture on this note, and it would have been a proper ending if I spoke to you some 10 or even 5 years ago. But the revelation of the Jedwabne murder and its entry into the public discourse triggered not only a proliferation of first-rate historiography of the Holocaust in Poland, but also what historian Piotr Forecki brilliantly described in a recently published book, a Jedwabne backlash, a vigorous pushback from the right-wing nationalist spectrum of the public. By a fluke of the electoral system and circumstances, a coalition representing this segment of the public has an absolute majority in the Polish parliament since 2015, as well as a president willing to sign into law anything that they put on his desk. Among many other misdeeds, they are busy destroying the institutional framework of constitutional democracy and the rule of law in Poland, they also fancy to rewrite many a chapter of the 20th century Polish history. They are very laboriously trying to expunge from public memory Lech Wałęsa as a historical leader and founder of Solidarity, for example, hoping to replace him in that role with the tragically deceased twin brother of the leader of the currently ruling political party, Law and Justice. And historical revisionism concerning Polish-Jewish relations during the war is very high on their agenda. A year ago, they passed a law criminalizing any mention of Poles' complicity in the German persecution of Jews in occupied Poland during World War II. And even though they amended it under pressure from Israel and the United States, the civil penalties are still on the books, threatening with fines those who would not conform to their mendacious historical revisionism. This will not deter research on the subject. I know my professional Polish colleagues well enough to be able to say so with confidence, but it will perpetuate general ignorance by effectively silencing school teachers, for example, or journalists. In closing, I would like to share with you an observation which came to me only recently. Following multiple conversations and discussions during conferences in which I participated, I realized that for most Poles, including superbly educated members of the so-called liberal intelligentsia, the Holocaust is an episode which had affected somebody else. What I want to say is that in the perception of the general public, or if one were to use a long-established sociological concept, in the collective memory of the Polish society, Holocaust is not conceived as a component part of mainstream Polish history. It is instead understood as something that has happened to them and not to us. How can a violent, man-induced, sudden death of 3 million Polish citizens be anything but a core event of the 20th century Polish history? Due to the peculiar demographic characteristics of the pre-war Jewish population, Jews made up 1/3 of Poland's urban residents, which means that as a result of the Holocaust, 1/3 of Poland's urban population was wiped out. How can this be a story exclusively about them and not also about us? As if one of the most acute chroniclers of wartime Warsaw, Ludwig Hering, had not written: Getto żyło Warszawą, Warszawa żyła gettem. Każdy wiedział o tym, każdy z tego korzystał. Warszawa żyła gettem jeszcze długo po jego śmierci, aż do własnego końca. Getto było sercem Warszawy. W ciągłym pulsowaniu przyjmowało i wydzielało. The ghetto lived off Warsaw. Warsaw lived off the ghetto. Everyone knew this. Everyone profited from it. Warsaw lived off the ghetto long after its death, until Warsaw's own end. Ghetto was Warsaw's heart. In constant pulsation, it received and it gave out, unquote. From the perspective of a social historian, such a conviction that the destruction of Polish Jewry has happened to them and not to us, or to put it in other words, the externalization of the Holocaust, requires as an underpinning a very peculiar mental framing of historical phenomena. It would be as if the French people espoused the belief, because victims of the terror came predominantly from the aristocracy, that the French Revolution was an episode in just the history of the French nobility. Thank you very much.